visceral for me. Just the smells, cars looking like aquariums, you know, people dragging soggy mattresses out of their homes. And I thought about how to cover it, what am I going to do, how am I going to write about this, and I called a scientist friend of mine at Columbia, and he said, well, one way to think about this is as a dress rehearsal for sea level rise. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, 9 feet is sort of the high end of what we're thinking about for how high the waters can come by the end of this century on the East Coast, and globally for that matter. So just imagine that water that came in for Hurricane Sandy came in, but then didn't go out. And that's what sea level rise will look like. And I'm like, wow, that's a pretty profound idea. And he said, well, you really want to blow your mind, go have that same thought experiment in Miami. And I was like, why? He said, go, you will see. And I did. I went there a few months later during king tides, and I was walking through 3 feet of water in Miami Beach on just a sunny day. The tidal flooding was so great there. And I was there for about 24 hours. This is a back picture that I pull out there. I was there about 24 hours and I realized how much trouble Miami was in. Because Miami is built on a very flat limestone plateau, and if anyone's ever been there, you know that it's a big pancake down there. Not a lot of elevation changes. You have a lot of real estate that's built right on the water, as you know, beachfront hotels, all of that, condos. And this limestone that it's built on is Swiss cheese. It's porous, so you can't really build walls and barriers like you can channeling the river here and things, because the water will go right underneath it and come up the other side. So I figured this out. It did not take a lot of real detective work to figure this out. It was very obvious, the trouble that South Florida is in, and I wrote a story for Rolling Stone called, with a very subtle title, Goodbye Miami, basically arguing that in a world that takes sea level rise seriously, in a world where, in our rapidly changing climate, Miami is in big trouble, and basically hard to imagine how Miami, as we know it today, survives through the end of the century. It doesn't mean that it'll be, completely vanished, that there will be people living there and it'll be reinvented in some way, but it's going to be a time of tremendous turmoil and change there, and a lot of people are going to lose a lot in Miami. This story that I wrote did not endear me to the Miami realtors. In fact, I told my kids, I have 3 kids, and I told them, I said, you've probably never heard of this woman, Karen Silkwood, but I said to them, when I said, if I'm ever found in a ditch with my brake lines cut, talk to Miami realtors. That's where you go. But the piece, besides kicking off a kind of hullabaloo, it made me think about, well, how are other people dealing around the world dealing with rising waters? And with Miami's in so much trouble, who's doing it right? And how do we think about this? What are the implications of this? And that's when I launched this book. That was the sort of mission of this book. One of the things I did was go to Greenland. This is a picture I took in Greenland, to look at the melting of the ice sheets. When you think about sea level rise, what really matters is what happens at the 2 poles. That is really the whole game. It doesn't matter what happens in glaciers on Mount Kilimanjaro or in Glacier National Park, where I'm going to Dancer tomorrow, which I'm very excited about. It all matters what happens in Greenland and what happens in Antarctica. That's the whole game. So I went there a number of times to have a look at that and write about that, and to visit it with some scientists and to see things firsthand. I went to Venice, another city well known for having water problems. Most of you probably know that Venice has been sinking for a long time. It's sinking because of groundwater pumping, and they've sort of stabilized that, but now the water is rising out of the sea around and in the lagoon, and they have big problems. So when I was there, I'd been to Venice before, but this is the first time I got there for this book. When I went there for this book, the first thought was, wow, this city is so fabulous, like built on water. Why can't we made a big mistake building cities on land. Every city should be like this. This is great, right? But then I I get there and I'm having an espresso at Piazza San Marco, getting over my jet lag, and the water just comes pouring into Piazza San Marco. I'm like, what is going on? And it was just like, oh, this is just high tide. This is what happens when we have high tides. And they put out these duck boards, and everybody just keeps walking along and just like dealing with it, which is interesting in several respects. But it is a very clear and present danger for Venice, with a lot of implications, which I talked about in the book. I went to the Marshall Islands, which is very, they're not just worried about like real estate values in the Marshall Islands. They're worried about existential things like, if our country is underwater, do we have like a virtual nation? What do we like, buy land in Arkansas and create, the virtual Marshall Islands? What happens to our fishing rights? What happens to our language? What happens to our culture? Do we try to preserve this? Do we not? Do we all just go to Australia and, give up our identities? Of course, they're not going to go to Australia because Australia is not exactly welcome to them, but maybe New Zealand. What do we do about the fact that our world is, going to go away? And so that was a very dramatic trip. I went to Alaska with this guy. Some of you may recognize. That was very interesting. I went to the Arctic Circle with him. He was trying to build up momentum for the Paris Climate Agreement at the time, and I was very privileged to go up there with him, travel around, talk to him about a bunch of climate issues, especially sea level rise. Spent an hour and a half he and I sitting in an 8th grade classroom in 2 little blue plastic chairs together, talking about changes in our climate and what the implications of that were, what that was. And that was very enlightening. I'm happy to talk about it later if you'd like. I was not a blind Obama kind of supporter. I had written a lot of critical stuff about him. But at this moment, at this time, he was really engaged in this, and it was quite an extraordinary time. So let me just talk about 5 things that I kind of learned, and reduce it all to a number of things that I think apply to what you're dealing with here, and also what I've learned from traveling around the world and thinking about this. And the first one is this, is that we're playing by different rules now, but nobody knows what those new rules are. And by that I mean, we're putting all this CO2 into the atmosphere, the heat dynamics are changing, but no one really knows what that means. We have lots of really good climate models, we have good estimations, good ideas, we're getting worse ideas, they're getting better, but how far what the changes are going to be is very difficult to predict, especially in a kind of really localized way. So to say that we're going to get, here in Des Moines, you're going to get 15% more precipitation, 20%, 25%, how that will arrive, what exactly the dynamics are, is very unclear. It's the same thing with sea level rise. We might get, if we're lucky, we might get 3 or 4 feet by the end of the century, we might get 13 feet by the end of the century. No one knows for sure because there's a lot, this climate system is very dramatic and very dynamic. And so one of the big lessons here is that what my friends at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, call the new normal, which is that there is no normal. We're now in this period of very dramatic change. And we see that in places, this is in northern Florida, where the water is now, that behind them used to be a road, and now is not a road, obviously, any longer. One of the things about sea level rise that people don't grasp is that, it's not like a hurricane or something where the water comes in and it goes away. It comes in and it stays in, and it keeps getting incrementally higher and higher and higher. High tides get incrementally higher. It doesn't retreat. It keeps getting higher. And that's a very big deal. This, I think that you've probably heard about the storms in Ellicott City in Maryland. Just this year, they had a 1,000-year rainstorm. The trouble is 2 years earlier, they had a 1 in 1,000-year rainstorm that devastated the city. And so we had back-to-back basically back-to-back 1 in 1,000-year rainstorms in a city that was, had just more pictures of that, still recovering from the devastation of the first one when the second one hit. And it's very kind of emblematic of the kind of regime we're in now with the climate is we don't know kind of what to expect. You think, oh, there's a 1 in 1,000-year storm, we're good now for a while, let's put that patio on we've been thinking about, you know? And that's not how it's going to play. They might get another big storm this year, next year. We don't know what the rules are. Now, the water will come, the question is how high and how fast. So with sea level rise, I didn't call my book, The Water Will Come Unless Everyone Puts Solar Panels on Their Roofs and Stops Driving an SUV and Eats Tofu for dinner. You know, I mean, the really important thing to grasp about sea level rise in general and climate change more broadly is that we're not going to stop even if we stop emissions right now. No matter how quickly we reduce emissions, which are really important for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. I'm not advocating any kind of relaxing of our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. It's hugely important if you want to think about maintaining something like a stable climate. But we're already, as my friend who's a theater producer says when she was on stage, in the river. We're in the river. It's moving, it's changing. If we cut all the carbon tomorrow, if we stop totally tomorrow, we'd still get, depending on which scientists you talk to, 5 to 30 feet of sea level rise. That's what's baked in. Because the heat that we've already built up in the world, in the climate, has been absorbed into the world's oceans. The world's oceans are like a big flywheel. They hold that heat, and it's going to take them a long time to release it. And as that heat is released, it's going to melt ice and cause sea level rise. So that's a really important idea to grasp that I really try to get to in this book. Another important idea to grasp, and I promise I think this is my last chart, is that I always thought about sea level rise as a sort of slow linear thing. It was just like, oh, you know, a millimeter a year or whatever, you know, not anything urgent. We can adapt, just like you move your towel back at one beach, you know, tide comes in, we'll just keep moving our towels back and everything will be cool. Well, one of the things that scientists have learned in the last decade or so is that sea level rise moves in pulses and has moved in pulses in the past. This is a chart of the last 25,000 years of sea level rise. And in this one area called the meltwater pulse 1A that you see right in the middle, there was 13 feet of sea level rise in a single century. So we don't know that I'm not saying that's happening now, but I'm saying that has happened in the past, and that we're pushing the system in very dramatic ways right now, and it's possible that we could get something like that is not beyond the realm of not only possible, but what has happened in the very, very recent past, from an Earth's point of view, in the very recent Earth's past. And I don't have to tell you what 13 feet of sea level rise would do to virtually every coastal city in the world. It would be catastrophic. And that's where we are. And let me just show you a picture of, I love to think about, this is a very dramatic picture of Miami Beach and Miami area with sea level rise. This is just a basic kind of model, but it gives you a sense of what a place like Miami is facing. So this is Miami more or less now, today. And this is Miami with just 7 feet of sea level rise. You can see that Miami Beach is submerged. You can see there's a little bit of high ground along the coast near downtown Miami itself. But what's really interesting, and again this goes to the unpredictability of how this is all going to play out, is that the water comes in from the Everglades, from the west, as much as it comes in from the Atlantic coast. Because as the water rises, it starts to kind of close in on these high areas. So places like Hialeah, Sweetwater, places that are 7 or 8 miles from the coast, they think, oh, we're fine here. We don't have to worry. The beach is 7 miles away. It's going to be a long time. Well, no. They're more at risk than a lot of the people that are right on the beach. And sadly, there's a Doral is in that area, which is where reports that he might need galoshes when he goes golfing there in the not-so-distant future. But it just shows that, like I said, this is the sort of predicting how this will play and who will be impacted and who will not be is really complicated. For sea level rise, it's also really true that trouble begins. It's not like, oh, there's sharks swimming through the Hilton on Miami Beach, I guess we're in trouble now. The troubles begin sort of long before that. The troubles begin when people start calculating the economic risk that their home investments have. The troubles begin when you have septic systems that begin to be inundated and begin leaching bacteria into the streets, which is already happening. And you'll read in my book about my venturing out into an area during flooding in Miami and not having the right shoes on, and being there with scientists and then telling me later that the bacteria count was 13,000 times the state recommended level. And I was like, next time I'm bringing my galoshes. But there were kids playing in that water. And so, I mean, this is one of the, consequences of these, of even modest levels of inundation that are hugely challenging for cities like Miami and other coastal cities to deal with. The other is changes in marine ecosystems. All of a sudden, you have creatures, places where you didn't have creatures before. If you go to Google, you can Google a YouTube of an octopus swimming in a Miami Beach parking garage. You start to get changes in who and what lives where as the salt water comes in. Corrosion, a huge issue for saltwater flooding. Not as big of an issue for freshwater flooding, but certainly for saltwater flooding. People who built these buildings, especially in places like Miami where they threw them up very quickly, but in many places they did not build these buildings for saltwater inundation. In fact, there was a really interesting study from the University of Wisconsin that I didn't put in my book because it just came out a month ago, talking about internet cables along coastal communities, coastal areas in the U.S., and that with even a modest amount of sea level rise, like a foot, 20% of the internet cables will be submerged. And of course, you can submerge fiber optic cables, no problem, but you have to build them in a way that you know you're going to be submerging them. So a lot of these were built without thinking that, well, we're building this for undersea cables. So there's a whole bunch of rethinking and replumbing that will have to be go on there. So there's all these sort of unexpected things that are complicated. And anyone who's ever lived in a coastal area where you're getting high tide flooding knows about how, it's like, I don't want to drive because I'm going to get rust on the undercarriage of my new Ford, and I don't want, to rust my car out. Or, I got to go pick up my aunt at the airport, but the roads are all closed getting to the airport, so what am I going to do? And, I mean, it's just, the consequences are easy to, or are hard to imagine until you sort of live through them. And the biggest one is, and this goes for all kinds of flooding, I think, but especially something like sea level rise, where it's such a certain thing, is this notion of real estate investment and what that means. Because, and this is the thing that coastal cities fear the most, because it's not, as I said, it's not when the sharks are swimming through the Hilton. It's when people understand that there will be sharks swimming through the Hilton. That's the problem. Because once you say, I have a house that's worth $500,000, and it's in a low-lying area, and sometimes we get a little bit of flooding on king tides out, but we're fine. We're just fine. Well, what happens in a very short amount of time when people start to calculate and see in flood maps and things, and start to understand that, well, in 20 years, though, that's going to be a lot different. And, what's that house going to be worth in 20 years? Do I want to buy a house that in 20 years might only be worth half as much? Or that I have to spend $100,000 elevating? And then if I elevate it, what happens with the road? And it just becomes a hugely different real estate calculation, both for commercial and homeowners. And there's even now, when I look at Miami Beach or parts of Norfolk or other parts of the country that are hugely at risk, I see a lot of stranded assets. I see a lot of mispriced risk. And this is a big concern for places because especially because of Miami, which is so built around development, that once once that tax base begins to erode, right? You start to have losing the tax bases and properties devalue. Then you, in a place like Florida where there's no state income tax, that's a really scary scenario. And it's also scary because you begin to get an erosion of tax base at exactly the time when you need more taxes to deal with all this stuff, to deal with roads being washed out, to deal with seawalls, to deal with all the consequences of all this stuff. So it becomes a really, how should I put it, radical economic situation, dynamic, where you have developers, as you have already in places like Florida, saying, let's knock down some of this cheap historical stuff that, you know, you might like, but doesn't really have, it's not going to stand any kind of, it's very vulnerable to sea level rise, and build some new, higher, more valuable property, which, you know, you can make some argument for, but it's also something that is pitting a lot of preservationists and historically minded people against, you know, development. One friend of mine describes it as gentrification by Mother Nature, and it's true. And it's, I think, the dynamic we're going to see playing out more and more in coastal cities. This is really important, I think, for both coastal flooding and for the kind of things that you will be thinking about dealing with here in the future, which is that billions of dollars are going to be spent on adaptation and protection. Some of it will be well spent, a lot of it will not. So I argue that we're moving into a kind of in coastal cities, a kind of triage moment where we have to decide, okay, what are we going to spend our money on, or we collectively. As a friend of mine had said, and I quote in the book, you know, you can only move so many lighthouses. You know, you can't afford to move all the lighthouses, so you think, okay, these are my 3 favorites, and we're going to move these. And that's broadly what's going to happen in coastal cities. Is not enough money to deal with this, to just say, oh, we're just going to elevate all of South Florida 4 feet and levitate it, and it will be fine, right? That's not going to happen. So what do you choose to elevate? What do you choose to protect? How do you make those decisions? Those are very, very complex and fraught political decisions, of course. And there are, of course, a lot of things that you can do. So elevating buildings is one, right? That's been done from the beginning of time. This is a picture of a big hotel, big brick hotel with 400 rooms in Chicago that they elevated with wood corkscrew jacks while the hotel was open. So there's stories about people drinking tea, watching the guys with the corkscrew things as they lift this giant building up, right? I mean, you can do that. It's a question of money and time and kind of proportion. So they basically elevated all of Chicago because they realized that Chicago, they had built it too close to the lake. And they were having problems with, septic systems and things, so they needed to put in a municipal sewer system. So instead of digging down and putting in sewer lines and everything, they decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and fix the flooding and the sewage problem at the same time by just elevating the entire city 7 feet. They just elevated all of Chicago. But Chicago then had wood sidewalks. It was like 25,000 people. You know, it was a manageable thing, right? Elevating Chicago today, of course, would be a whole other kind of scenario. Elevating Miami, elevating any coastal city is a whole different thing. But, you know, it's certainly what's going on. And I was just talking to an architect from Charleston, South Carolina last night at a little event, and he was talking about how that is changing now in Charleston, for example. They're beginning to, before, with all this historic buildings and everything, they had been reluctant to raise them because it changes the landscape of the streets. This is what's going on in Jersey. So you have, these they're like monster truck houses. Obviously this one's on Jack, but you go to Metro, the Jersey Shore, and you see these houses that are just way up there. And it's fine, right? That house is probably going to be okay for a while, right? But it changes the fabric of the neighborhood, and place in a big way. And for a place like Charleston, for example, which is very concerned, and rightfully so, about its historic neighborhoods and the sort of dignity and character of those neighborhoods, which are among, I would argue, the most beautiful places from an urban point of view in the United States. How do you elevate a place like that, and do it in a way that just doesn't make it look like some sort of, old-timey version of this? So that is something now, so up until recently they had said, we're not elevating anything, but that is now changing because they just got hit with Hurricane Irma. People there are sick of it. We've been flooded and flooded and flooded, and we got to do something. So there's a lot of really sophisticated thinking going on now about how do you elevate these structures, how do you keep the city coherent as this happens. And there's certainly better and worse ways of thinking about this, and there's certain inevitability to it. But there's also a certain inevitability to the costs. This is going to cost a lot. The architect I was talking to last night was saying $300,000 to elevate some of these houses in Charleston, and that's certainly, if your house is worth $5 million, that's probably worth it. But it's still a lot of money. And then you still have the questions of, okay, so you elevate your house, what happens to the houses around it, what happens to the streets, what happens to the airport, what about all this other stuff, right? There are also, cities are doing a lot with improving drainage. So this is what's happening in Miami Beach. They're spending $400 or $500 million improving drainage, putting in pumps. Laura talked about pumps here. Similar things being done in many coastal cities now to get the water out of there. And it works well for a while, but in a place like Miami, you can't pump 6 feet of sea level rise out of the city. So pumps are a sort of short-term and expensive Band-Aid that helps for the moment, but are not the long-term solution. And people are already there's already some pushback about it, that we've spent $500 million on these pumps, and I was there for King Tide last year, and it's still flooded because some of the pumps broke or didn't have power or whatever reasons. So there was a lot of pushback. It was like, we spent all this money and we're still having problems. And then the notion of spending another $500 million before, because this is only a few neighborhoods in Miami Beach, not the whole island by any stretch. So it gets really expensive really fast. The other obvious option is building walls, which is the time-honored defense against rising water. But as, again, I keep talking about what Laura talked about, because she was so on point about many things. She talked about the wall on the river here being built to 24 feet, and then 2 years later, whatever the time was, flood came at 27 feet, and it goes over, and city floods anyway. There's always that question with walls: how high do you build? Especially complicated in something like sea level rise, where you have a sort of ever-rising number. It's not like roulette of like, oh, are we going to have a big rainstorm or not? It's certainly going to happen. So what are you building to? And then there's the very complicated political question of who's behind the wall, who's not. So this is an example of what's called the Big U in Manhattan, which was proposed after Hurricane Sandy. This Lower East Side, on the right side there, is where the most severe flooding was. And this all looks good if you live on 42nd Street or below, but what if you live on 43rd Street or 44th Street? And you go, well, what about me? How come you stop right there, right? And what if you live in Red Hook, in the Bronx, or in Queens, or in Brooklyn, or anywhere like that is also very vulnerable. You're not going to have a multi-billion-dollar wall designed by a Danish architect out in those kinds of neighborhoods. So the social justice issues are huge in this. And by the way, they don't like it when I call it a wall. They like me to call it a barrier with amenities. So this is barriers with amenities, which I guess means cappuccinos and things on the top. I want to do just a couple last things. So sometimes opportunity comes to catastrophe. So Laura talked about moving the river, which happened here. I went to the Netherlands, where they had massive problems with flooding from a river that kept breaking over its bounds. And instead of building higher and higher walls, they decided to build essentially a channel beside the river to help alleviate that flooding. Actually, what they call it, room for the river, letting the river spread out. And that's what they've broadly done in like 30 different places on the river as it flows out to the Atlantic, is instead of trying to hem it in, they've given it room to spread out. They're just choosing kind of where it spreads out. And that's a very kind of profoundly different way of thinking for the Dutch. This is a little schematic of what they did. Because they had been, of course, the ones who had built barriers and dikes and everything for so long. But one of the profound ideas that the Dutch have figured out is that, in the future, because of the changes that we're seeing, the real story is how do you live with water. That's the sort of mantra for the Dutch now, is living with water, whether that means room for the river ideas of letting the river spread out more naturally, whether it means floating structures, adaptability, change, not big walls that may or may not collapse, that may or may not be jumped over. And I saw a lot of really sort of inspiring ideas about how people will be changing and living with water. One is this schoolhouse in Lagos, Nigeria, in these water slums. And this is a very simple project by a Dutch Nigerian architect, just with oil barrels and obviously 2x4s and cheap stuff. They built this floating community center that was a huge hit in this town, in the city of Lagos. And it was just, to me, a really great example of the solutions to some of these problems don't need to be multi-billion-dollar things. Unfortunately, I must tell you that this should have been a little bit more closer to, a little bit more substantial, because a big storm came shortly after this picture was taken and blew down. So that was not good. But it was always thought of as a prototype anyway. They're building another one. But it's just an example of how people are thinking differently. The Dutch are thinking about floating farms. This is where they're going with this stuff. This is a profound idea of living with water, right? Why can't we do floating farms? This is a friend of mine, an architect in Miami, thinking about what he calls platform cities in Biscayne Bay. And he uses a lot of the technology and engineering from oil drilling derricks and things to imagine a city that is living on water, right? That is on top of the water. There's no reason why this kind of thing can't happen. There's certain engineering challenges and things, but I think that all of this flooding, all of this changes in sea level rise, all the stuff that I've been talking about is inspiring a lot of really interesting creative thinking. Because there's no, it's not like the way our world is built right now is like perfection. We've done a lot of dumb stuff, and this is a way of rethinking a lot of things and rethinking our relationship with our climate, with our world around us, right? Because one of the things I learned in reporting this book is that the problem of sea level rise is the problem of built infrastructure. Same with the river. It's a problem of built infrastructure. It wasn't a problem when the river flooded when nobody lived here, right? That was not an issue, right? It's an issue because of where you've built and how you've built it. And it's the same thing with Miami Beach or the Netherlands or Venice. It's a problem of how we have built. And no one is going to die from sea level rise per se. No one's going to stand there on the beach and just slowly drown as the water comes up, right? Obviously, there's risks from storms and things like that. And obviously, climate change is a huge risk. But it's really about how we think about organizing our world. And for a long time, we thought like the land is here, the sea is here, the water's here, and that's how it is. Those are fixed points. And one of the things that we're learning now is that they're not. They're changing, and they're changing fast. So how do we re-engineer our world to deal with that? And that, I think, is the broad challenge that we face, not just with sea level rise, but with climate change in general. So I reduced all this to the what do we do now, because everybody always wants to know, what do we do now? And so here's what I thought about when I finished this book. One is remembering this is not an alien invasion, right? This is not like we need to invent some gamma ray gun kill these weird creatures that are getting out of spaceships, or we're all doomed. Right? This is like dealing with flooding, with water, with our relationship with the world. It doesn't require any new technology per se, right? It just requires thinking differently about how we use the technology and engineering skills that we have. It's essentially a political and cultural change, not a technological change. Of course, we're all happy for innovation. Certainly innovation matters a lot on the energy side, but on the adapting to water side, it's really about engineering and culture and politics. It's not about, we don't need Elon Musk for this, as much as we like Elon Musk, or Steve Jobs, bless his soul. Making risk transparent to everyone, I think, is hugely important in coastal cities, but also in places like this. As I showed in the photo, water coming in Florida from the Everglades, from the west side, as much as it comes in from the Atlantic side. A lot of people have no idea the risks that they face. And that is a big problem, because people need to be able to make their own decisions. I think it's great if somebody wants to continue living in South Florida, while the alligators are wandering around their doorsteps, and, if they want to take a submarine to work, whatever, that's all great, right? It's a question of knowing what's coming and understanding what's coming. And we do a very poor job of that. Our FEMA maps, as most of you know, are outdated, very poorly designed, incredibly difficult to access for anyone. I was just in Washington yesterday talking to the people at the GAO, the General Accounting Office, about the role of federal government. And, one of the key things, I think, is, their job is to help people understand what the risks are, so that people can make their own decisions about how to deal with that. And I think that also applies to insurance pricing. Right now, the flood insurance market is really contorted for a number of reasons. Mostly the National Flood Insurance Program is itself very contorted and up for renewal now, but we don't price risk appropriately. And if risk were priced appropriately, people would say, I'm out of here. I'm not paying $30,000 a year or $15,000 a year for flood insurance. I'm going to go somewhere. I'm going to go live on a little mountain somewhere, and I'll take my risks with wildfires or whatever. Or you might say, you know what, 15 grand, I don't care. I like this beach. I'll pay 15 grand. But as long as handcuffs, please. As long as the price is transparent, great, right? But it's not right now. So we have these things where people get wiped out. They weren't aware of how much they were at risk. They're waiting for government to bail them out. Government, FEMA or whoever is saying, and sometimes they're saying yes 16 times and keep rebuilding things over and over and over again, so that you and I are paying for this in our taxes with these crazy disaster bills. Or sometimes they're not rebuilding them. Like I said, I was in Puerto Rico. Many large percentage, over half of the houses that were destroyed there, FEMA's not paying for, because of various problems with property rights or ownership or title or all kinds of things. So they're really suffering there because of these, kind of arcane laws about disaster relief. Right? I talked about that. A price on carbon pollution. As I said earlier, when you think about what we're facing in our world and how do we stabilize our climate, there's nothing more important than reducing carbon emissions. That can change the trajectory of sea level rise, change the dramatic changes in rainfall that you're likely to see here. It's really the most urgent kind of policy task that we have, and at some point we're going to figure that out, and at some point we're going to do that, and it's inevitable, and it would be good if that inevitability happens sooner rather than later, because one of the problems with climate change is that we're front-loading all this stuff, right? The CO2 that goes into the atmosphere is not like the stuff that comes out of your, the stuff that makes smog that comes out of your tailpipe. I grew up in California, and I remember when I was a kid, these guys would yell at me about all the air pollution, right? And then they invented catalytic converters and required catalytic converters on cars. All of a sudden, oh wow, I live by mountains. I didn't know that, right? CO2 is not that way. CO2 stays in the atmosphere, for hundreds of years. And so what we're putting in there now is going to stay there for a very long time. It means that our kids, my kids, your kids, and our grandkids are going to be living in this radically changing world for a long time. And so it's the more we cut sooner rather than later, the more we can preserve this stable climate in the long run for our kids. And finally, this idea of retreat is not a dirty word. That it kind of is a dirty word, but I have to say it, and I'll say it. Nobody wants to hear about retreat. Nobody wants to say, you know what, we built our house in the wrong place, or this city, this part of the city, we can't keep paying for this. But that's where we're going to be very soon. Not because I advocate it or anybody advocates it, but the economics are going to drive this. So the question is, how do we structure that? What are the political, how do we begin to think about this in a kind of way that makes sense so that as these retreats happen, it's not just the Mad Max scenario of everybody running for their lives kind of thing, but intelligent understanding of risk, stopping building in low-lying areas that are at risk, which is exactly the opposite of what happens in many cities as the economy begins to, they have trouble in their economy. First thing that happens, and this happens in cities that were hit by storms and things, is that instead of making building standards tougher, they make them, they lower them, and they allow people to build in zones where they wouldn't build before because they need the development so badly that they encourage more building, and then they just think, well, FEMA will take care of it if when a storm comes. That kind of thinking is really, really, really where we need to not be, because for places like this, for places like Miami, for places like Norfolk, for places like Boston, for places like New York, for places like Bangladesh, for places like the Netherlands, people are going to retreat. People are going to say, we can't live this way anymore, we're going to go. And how we manage that, I think, is a task that needs to be talked about and beginning to be think about. And it is being talked about and thought about, but just not in public. City officials in many cities that I are beginning to say, you know what, these water lines out here, I'm not sure we're going to be upgrading them anytime soon because I'm not sure that neighborhood's going to be around in 20 years. So do we really need to be putting money into these water lines out here? Those kinds of discussions are being had right now, but they need to become more explicit so people can, again, make their own decisions about how they think about where they live. And I want to end now with last thing. And this is one of the things that I think about when I think about this book and what I learned is that a scientist that I talked to, a very brilliant woman in Florida, who said, so Jeff, the one thing that you always need to remember when you're thinking about water is never to fight a war with water because water always wins. And she said, and I said, that's it. And she said, go look at the Grand Canyon. And I said, okay. And we went to look at the Grand Canyon. And it was, a very profound experience for me to be there and see that. And you think that this canyon was carved by water, right? That's what did that. And thinking about her future and, what kind of world we're building. And for me, that's sort of what it's all about. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
I just want to add another Grand Canyon analogy.
All right.
In that many drops of water is what made the Grand Canyon. And many drops of water from us speaking to our political officials, what it's going to take to make the political will to affect change.
Hopefully it'll happen a little faster than the Grand Canyon did.
Yeah.
That would be good. I fear your analogy made me too true.
Hang on one second. I'm going to pass to you.
It's just my name at gmail.com.
lucky enough to read your book not long after it came out last year.
Thank you.
And the marshlands are also being destroyed, which is a very serious ecological problem. And a lot of times people with limited incomes live in these low-lying water areas. Their needs are not being addressed because they don't have money, so they are being ignored. And where are they going to go when this happens? And thirdly, the cost of building these seawalls is in the millions and billions. Where does all this money come from? And lastly, are you writing another book?
I'll go from the last one first. So yes, but I don't know what it is yet. I have a couple of ideas, but I don't know what they are. You're right. Where is the money going to come from? Is in seawalls, all kinds of adaptation. I was actually talking about that in Washington yesterday. Because the scale of this is of what it's going to cost to help coastal cities, not to mention places like this, as climate change impacts accelerate, deal with that is just overwhelming and enormous. And it's easy to see where you can get private investment on the energy side of things, right? So if you put money into building and investing and researching a cheaper solar panel, right? If you're successful, you're going to sell 12 bajillion of them, right? It's the pathway to a profit is pretty straightforward on the energy side. On the adaptation side, it's not. And so where is the money going to come from for the seawalls that you mentioned? I mean, even New York, a rich city like New York, they want to build this big wall around Lower Manhattan. There's still no clear price tag for it, but $8 billion, something like that, $7 billion maybe. Where's that money going to come from? And you have the richest, most valuable real estate in the world there, and it's still not exactly clear where that money is going to come from. It's certainly not going to come from Donald Trump, right? And it's certainly not going to come from Congress. New York State will help some, they'll get some federal money, but still, it's a huge deal. And so, as I mentioned, then when you think about the lower income neighborhoods, and where that money will come from, it's very hard to see that. And philanthropic groups have been stepping up a lot because they understand the social justice issues here, and I really applaud that. But it's still, not enough, not going to be anywhere near enough. And that's where we go back to retreating, because it's going to become apparent to, everybody that, we can't just think that we're going to build a seawall and be okay, because we're not. And so, at a certain point, people are just going to begin leaving areas, right? And what that means, the implications of that are really enormous. And, as you pointed out, the Marshall Islands is a great example of the sort of social justice part of this. And that I did a calculation in my book, and I don't remember it exactly now, but it basically, to the best of my ability of calculating it, the entire history of CO2 emissions for the Marshall Islands since the beginning of the 20th century is about 1/3 of the annual emissions of the city of Portland. Right? So basically they did nothing. And this is broadly true of many places. After many undeveloped nations, or developing nations, then they did not cause the problem, and they're the ones who are suffering and will suffer the most from it. And so that was what made the then foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, Tony DeBruyn, who sadly passed away last year. He was like the moral leader in Paris, the Paris Climate Agreement. He basically stood up in front of all the countries of the world and said, look, this is an existential crisis for my country. We didn't cause this problem. You, meaning the developed West, the rich West, the Europeans, the Americans, the Australians, the Chinese, are the ones who caused this. You need to do something about it. You need to help us. You need to reduce emissions. And, we all know what happened to the Paris Agreement now, but it's sort of on, how should we say, on hiatus. But I believe it will be kind of brought back, and it was not a futile effort. But to the degree that there was ambition in that effort, it was because of the moral voice of Tony DeBruyn from the Marshall Islands. And I kind of think that kind of thing of speaking out, of people who are going to be impacted by this and who don't have either the means to deal with it themselves, and also were not part of the problem, right? They're not the ones who are causing this. It's going to be increasingly the dynamic of this story as it goes forward. Yeah.
Let's start up here, and then I'll text a question down below. Your last point was we, don't get into a fight with water. I kind of grew up in a city where, getting out of school to go fight water was, as expected as spring prom. Grew up, came to Des Moines, fought water in '93, fought water, several other times. And in the immediate situation where we have to fight to save property, save homes, save businesses, etc., it always strikes me that we're fighting that fight the way we fought it 200 years ago with brigades of sandbags, like fighting a fire with a brigade of buckets. And it's unfortunate we don't have some technology for the intermediate fight as we deal with these long-range issues. Is there any entity, group around the world that maybe has jumped ahead in that technology? And I keep, when I'm filling sandbags and building dikes, thinking, well, gosh, we could have giant Legos that we fill with water, and etc. So, is there any? Well, again, that was the question.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of innovative, uses of different kinds of kind of snap together barriers and things like that people are using to deal with storm surges and flooding in the immediate, at that immediate moment. In New York, they have these sort of big inflatable balloons kind of thing that they're putting around subway entrances. There's a big, essentially a kind of door on the Lincoln Tunnel to close it off, and they put in, because that was a big problem with Hurricane Sandy was, once you get water into these tunnels, it's a kind of disaster. So there's a lot of thinking about, how do we protect things in the, immediate moment that is a kind of disaster preparedness, right? And that's getting better and better. And there's, I think there's a lot of innovative technologies and money, frankly, to be made, a lot of investment going on in that. But that is not going to save you in the big picture, right? I mean, ultimately, when you put up the flood wall like every other day, it becomes that temporary flood wall becomes a permanent flood wall, and then that brings in all the questions of flood walls and all the things that I mentioned. So, there's ways of buying time, which all those things are, and they're all important, but they're not a replacement for sort of long-term or even medium-term strategic thinking about how to deal with this changing world we live in. Yes?
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the effects might be of sea level rising on the Midwest here, a place like Iowa, and then also maybe what things we might should be considering when we're thinking about working with water.
Well, I mean, I don't think even for Iowa, sea level rises. I mean, you could argue, a good thing in the sense that people are. I mean, on my boat tour, I had a reading in Asheville, North Carolina, and like 300 people showed up, and I was like, "What are you guys all doing here? Why are you all?" I mean, it's not nice, I'm sure you love the book, but really, there's a lot of people here. And it turned out that a lot of them had moved from the Outer Banks to Asheville because they were like tired of being flooded and tired of living on the coast and wanted to live in a different place. And I think that's broadly a calculation that's already going on around the country and is going to accelerate as time goes. People are going to start to think, well, is this a good place for me? Is this a safe place for me to think about where I want to raise my kids? I was in Detroit 2 weeks ago, and, I was urging them to think about that from the sense of like rebuilding and reimagining what Detroit could be like, because that's a city where, they're desperate for growth again, for thinking differently about things, and it's a city that's very appealing in many ways. And you can imagine that, as people begin to make these calculations. So, I mean, there's that part of it, right? That's a real upside kind of to the degree that there is one. You know, start running ads in Miami Beach, come to Des Moines. Freshwater won't corrode your Ferrari. Right? You know, it's not going to have direct impacts on, I mean, I don't think it's going to have much direct impacts on river flow and things like that. It will certainly closer to the mouths of the rivers, but not up here. I mean, the big changes is what Laura talked about with precipitation changes and humidity changes, agricultural changes related to that. So there's real climate change and flooding issues, but I don't think, you know, direct, you know, consequences of sea level rise. Yes.
I heard one of our Iowa climate scientists talk about sea level rise, and one of the things that he pointed out that I hadn't heard before that kind of blew me away was it's not only a matter of the polar ice caps are melting, but also the water is getting warmer, and warm water expands, so the volume is also increasing, which, you know, of course then adds to the intensity of storms and all of that stuff. But I hadn't thought about that piece of it before, because that's something that, you know, we talk about the polar ice caps, but we don't talk about the warmer water. And, you know, Katrina, I think somewhere around 6,000 people died. And then when the tsunami hit Indonesia, it wiped out 300,000 people at once. And you could argue that a lot of our problems are in some ways attributable to global population. And so is it necessarily a bad thing that we wipe out a lot of coastal population?
That's an easier conversation to have in Iowa than it is. I've never got that question in Miami. Funny. Well, let me just say a couple things. First of all, that idea, the water expands is certainly true, and that's been about half of the sea level rise from the 20th century. But going forward, it's a very, very minor part of what we're going to be worried about. It's not really a problem for thinking about things in the future. You know, for global population, you know, I mean, certainly sea level rise is related to the way that we've built on the coast, right? And I don't think then you necessarily go from there to saying, okay, well, it's good to wipe them out. You know, I think that maybe the idea of building differently, relocating, you know, people love living on water. I love living on water. I live on a lake, but, you know, an architect friend of mine in Miami said that if he could build a structure that just sort of hovered like a magic carpet on the water, and people just have this sort of infinity view of the Atlantic, that would be the perfect place that's what people want, right? And so you see all these high-end real estate developments along the coast, and they're always like unimpeded views, right? People love, there's all kinds of psychological reasons that people have written about. So we love living with water, and the question is, how do we find out ways to do that don't, you know, put our you know, coastal cities and economics of these coastal cities, you know, hugely at risk. I mean, it can be done. I didn't talk about, you know, Lagos, where I went. I mean, you know, we have lots of people there there's 300,000 people or so who live in these water slums there. And you talk to them about sea level rise or storm surges, and they're like, we don't care if the water raises 4 feet. We'll raise our houses in an afternoon. We'll be fine. And, you know, that idea of flexible building is something that we've totally forgotten about. Right.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everybody. If you have more questions, he's going to be out in the atrium signing books and things. I encourage you to ask him questions. He has plenty of good information, and you have plenty of good questions, but I've got to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.